Alright you guys, this episode of Paradigm Profiles is called Hawaiian Gardens Operation Knockout. VHG, also known as Barrio Hawaiian Gardens, has a history dating back all the way to the 1940s. With over 2,000 active members, they claim the entire city of Hawaiian Gardens, more specifically in the southern area of Carson Street, between 219th Street and 226th Streets. There's also subsets or cliques in this area, such as the Malditos and the Loquitos, which means little crazy ones. They've been known to use the mascot of Hawaiian Punch Kool-Aid Punchy, a cartoon that debuted in 1961 during the Kool-Aid frenzy back in the 60s and 70s. Like a lot of other gangs who have adopted a mascot or a symbol to represent their gang, this mascot Punchy was tattooed in different styles and in different forms to show their allegiance to the Hawaiian Gardens gang. And again, analogous to other gangs, the bigger the tattoo, the better, and blasting it in the craziest places like on your neck, your head, or your face meant the downer for your shit you were. Another notable passage in this gang's history is the fact that it produced an individual by the name of Luis Weddle Buff Flores. Weddle Buff was an active and highly influential member of VHG who would later become the founder of the Mexican Mafia prison gang. He was the mastermind who would ultimately create the MA, but others that would come later, such as Cheyenne Cadena, became the visionaries and the architects who would not only breathe life into the MA, but they were also credited with transforming it into a criminal organization. Ironically, after serving 5 years on drug charges, Weddle Buff returned home and celebrated by drinking a bottle of tequila. Soon, alcohol became a means of escaping some of his everyday afflictions. It eventually caught up with him, and he died of alcohol poisoning in 1991. In 2007, VHG would make national headlines after one of its up-and-coming members, named Jose Sepia Rasco, was sentenced to death for the murder of Los Angeles deputy Jerry Ortiz, as well as the attempted murder of an African American the previous day. Whether it's just negative propaganda generated by the mainstream media or whether there was in fact some truth to it, one thing was for sure. VHG definitely had a long-standing history of being involved in several attacks that were squarely directed at the African American people in that community. However, this wasn't something that VHG stood alone in. This seemed to be a common trend that a lot of other Sureño gangs were engaged in as well. The origins originated in the California prison system and were the result of prison politics. Some of the other gangs that became the front runners in this conflict began being referred to as hate gangs. This included, but was not limited to, Azusa 13, Compton, Barrio 155, and the Avenues. During the peak of this conflict, these gangs were said to have shared a common goal: to cleanse and purge their neighborhoods of all African Americans by any means necessary. This conflict can be traced back to the 1990s. For example, in 1993, members from Barrio Hawaiian Gardens allegedly threw a firebomb, Molotov cocktail, through the window of Cynthia Hayes. She managed to rush her children outside to avoid being burned alive, only to find out that her home had been vandalized with graffiti depicting racial slurs. In 1999, Virgil Henry, a 24-year-old African American who lived in Van Nuys, was beat to death by alleged VHG gang members after visiting his parents who lived in Hawaiian Gardens. According to several onlookers, Virgil Henry was chased down near Carson Street after noticing an angry mob yelling racial derogatory terms. Henry supposedly ran through the parking lot of a nearby shopping center in an attempt to escape. Unfortunately, he was eventually surrounded, and the VHG members allegedly took turns beating him with the baseball bat. Police would end up arriving minutes after the attack started, only to find him suffering from multiple head injuries with a portion of his head bashed in. In 1996, 27-year-old Martin Hammonds, an African-American male and a former high school football player, was shot to death by Rudy Villa, a member of the Barrio Hawaiian Gardens gang. The shooting took place in mid-afternoon as Hammonds walked down a busy street, Norwalk Boulevard. Rudy Villa was later convicted of the murder and sentenced to 65 years to life in prison. Later on in that same year, Michael Bennett, a middle-aged African-American, survived multiple attacks, losing several of his teeth after receiving a vicious beating by members of the Barrio Hawaiian Gardens gang. Michael Bennett was also the uncle of late slain victim Martin Hammonds. So this is just a small glimpse into some of the history of VHG and a few of the incidents that have resulted in the negative exposure this neighborhood has gotten. The 90s was definitely a tumultuous time for some of these neighborhoods that were being labeled as hate gangs. But almost 10 years after the killing of Martin Hammonds, VHG would make national headlines again. On June 24, 2005, Los Angeles Sheriff's Deputy Jerry Ortiz was gunned down by an alleged gang member he was attempting to arrest on suspicion of shooting an African-American man. While the alleged gang member, Jose Sepia Rasco, was quickly apprehended in 2009 and currently sits on California's death row, the shooting of Deputy Ortiz sparked an extensive investigation that culminated in the 2 massive gang sweeps. Anytime a law enforcement officer is killed in the line of duty, let alone in cold blood, everyone knows that this is going to end up bringing a lot of heat to the streets. The analogy would be the same as smacking a beehive and having a swath of angry bees descending all over the streets in attack mode. Regardless of how much you brace for it and despite the preparations you take, there's only so much you can do to avoid it. When they come through for something like this, they're taking down everything and anyone in their path. At the conclusion of their investigation, approximately 170 gang members and associates were taken into custody on a litany of federal charges. The case was charged as a RICO indictment after prosecutors discovered how far-reaching the investigation was and the astonishing number of suspects that were intricately involved. The investigation literally snowballed and continued to grow from one arrest to the next, not just because of how messy the case was, but also because of all the weak links that dropped off and cooperated. The lead defendant, who was brought in on one of the nation's largest gang sweeps ever, was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. Prosecutors were able to articulate how he played a pivotal role in helping to coordinate the racketeering activities and how he utilized the street gang he belonged to, Hawaiian Gardens, to distribute large quantities of narcotics. George Boxer Flores was sentenced by United States District Judge Dale S. Fisher, who presided over Boxer's racketeering indictment. This was the centerpiece of Operation Knockout. Not only was Boxer the lead defendant in the RICO indictment, he was also a longtime member of the Hawaiian Gardens gang, and he had a lot of influence within his neighborhood. Depending on circumstances and what was happening, i.e. who was out and what type of activities the MA was coordinating, he also acted as an intermittent shot caller who was able to issue orders to other gang members and collect taxes from local drug dealers. This was all done under the auspices of the Mexican Mafia. When the investigation had concluded and various law enforcement agencies decided that they had attained the sufficient evidence they needed, almost 1,400 law enforcement officials converged on the Hawaiian Gardens gang in a series of pre-dawn raids. This was a massive operation that involved a multitude of various law enforcement agencies. These raids were executed as being part of the largest federal indictment investigation against a street gang in United States history. Hawaiian Gardens, Hawaiian oldest and most notorious gang, allegedly waged a racist campaign to eliminate black people from the community via attempted murders and other crimes, according to the federal racketeering indictment. A total of 5 indictments charged 147 members and associates of the gang with crimes specific to this one indictment. But the racial disparities have gone far back into history and have involved a lot of other gangs besides just Hawaiian Gardens. It seems like the racial tensions between African Americans and Mexican Americans have always just been one incident away from erupting, and that these powder kegs have virtually been everywhere. I don't want to delve off too deep into this subject, but I think this goes a lot deeper than just gang politics. I think some of it is spurred behind demographics and some of the consequential effects that it creates in some of these poverty-stricken neighborhoods. Not just in Southern California, but also in Northern California and across the nation as well. I remember back in the 1980s when the number of undocumented Mexican immigrants started to grow from a trickle to a tsunami. It was during this time when Southern California's economy began to shift. Its heavy industries, tire, automotive, steel, factory jobs left the country, taking well-paid union jobs with them. They were replaced by service jobs, non-union construction, and minimum wage factory work. These were the kind of jobs nobody wanted, as they were considered to be back-breaking workhorse jobs. However, the Mexicans who arrived found jobs at the bottom rungs of this new economy, and they took full advantage of these opportunities, and they were resented for it. Even though these were the jobs nobody else wanted, the general consensus was that these undocumented illegals were breaking the economy by taking these jobs and agreeing to work for wages that nobody else was willing to work for. Seeking the cheapest housing, many found it in black-dominated areas, Compton, Inglewood, South Central, just as black gangs in those neighborhoods were emerging as a powerful new force in urban life. In time, Mexican migrants would transform those areas, but for many years they remained outnumbered and silent. With the power and demographic relationships so tilted in their favor, Crips and Bloods made constant victims of the newly arrived immigrants. For many migrants in those areas, their formative experience of life in the United States was working for much higher pay than they could get in Mexico, usually paid in cash, and then being robbed of that hard-earned money by some of the black gangs. But it wasn't only the black gangs. This trend of victimizing paisas was something that was also happening in Northern California as well. It was happening everywhere. Why? Because they were easy targets who always carried large amounts of cash. They always had cash on them because this is how most of them got paid, under the table, unable to work legitimately. Another one of their disadvantages is that they had no protection. They became permanent victims. That's just the reality of it. Most of them wouldn't call the police either, because if they did, they ran the risk of being deported. So they were constantly just being beaten up and robbed. They'd be working construction jobs and get paid in cash on Friday. The black gangs, the Crips and the Bloods, would be waiting for them, armed to the teeth. This humiliation at the hands of their black neighbors fostered a resentment towards black people in general that festered for years in emerging Mexican neighborhoods. These are the ugly truths that a lot of people squander away from, but if we're going to keep it real, then let's keep it real. Most of these paisas were small guys too, and in the streets the rules are simple. If you didn't know how to fight, you were a perpetual victim. That was the same in every neighborhood. Then, in the 1980s, a shift began in many parts of Los Angeles. Some areas, like Florence Firestone, went from 80% black to 90% raza. Compton, Inglewood, Linwood, and black enclaves on both sides of the 110 became majority raza. More Latino families began moving into these areas and things started to change. Even the look of the whole landscape changed. When the raza moved in, you started to see the street vendors, the taco trucks, and in some areas, you would see a congregation of paisas waiting somewhere to be hired for an under-the-table job. The same way you might see them posted up outside of a Home Depot. On the streets for a time, black and Mexican gangs maintained an uneasy balance of power. They often occupied parallel universes on the same streets, focusing less on each other and more on rivals of their own race in other neighborhoods. This is a commonality that always plays out. Gangs need to be constantly preying on something, and when it's not their rivals, they'll often resort to house cleaning or self-purging. That was not the case, however, in California's prison system, which at around the same time began something of an incubator for racial animus. The Mexican Mafia was largely formed behind bars. Many of its first jailhouse gang members weren't immigrants. They were second-generation Mexican Americans who barely spoke a word of Spanish. But together with Sureño alliances, the MA regulated drugs, gambling rackets, and maintained the group's own brutal order in prison yards across the state. They also, and this is key, went to war with black gangs throughout the prison system. When they weren't battling one another, the brown and black inmates maintained an almost Jim Crow-like segregation, using separate water fountains, separate showers, and separate telephones, not so much as bumming a cigarette from one another. These weren't policies that CDC was implementing. These were policies that the inmates themselves were implementing. Racial segregation became a norm in prison, and this wasn't something that the white inmates alone were doing. Everyone was doing it. Predictably, this prison-bred animosity eventually spread beyond jailhouse walls as a younger, more business-minded generation of ME, the Pepsi generation they were called, took their prejudices with them when they cycled out of the system. In the 1980s, this was not happening on the street. But all the gang members coming into the jail system were being indoctrinated into this no black thing. They go back out into the street and those rules became policy, or edicts that were being pushed and strongly enforced. Inevitably, the no black thing eventually led to open warfare with black versus brown skirmishes erupting in the 1990s all over LA. On the west side, Shoreline Crips battled Venice 13. In Compton, Fruittown Pyrus and Tortilla Flats, who had coexisted more or less peacefully, began a brutal conflict that stretched on for years. Meanwhile, various Sureño gangs that formed in and out of prison began to coalesce into a more unified force. In 1992, I'm sure a lot of you remember, longtime Mexican Mafia member Peter Sano Ojeda and the meeting he held at El Salvador Park in Santa Ana. This turned out to be a pivotal moment in gang history at which the prison-born Eme took operational control over pretty much all Sureño street gangs. They began holding meetings, sending emissaries to other Sureño street gangs, and establishing something like an underground economy by taxing drug dealers in their neighborhoods, a system of extortion that still exists today in many barrios across Southern California. The Nuestra Familia implements a similar method of extorting the street gangs in Northern California as well. It's effectuated under the pretenses of contributing to the cause or for the betterment of the people. But behind the smoke screens and the masquerades, it's just another form of extortion. But when Sana implemented these changes and the Eme asserted operational control over the Sureño street gangs, they also did one other thing as well. They went to war with the black gangs. However, this wasn't entirely a racial motivated decision. It was also economic. In a cold prison calculus, the Mexican Mafia set out to crush drug dealing competition from the black gangs who made crack cocaine in the big business. They specifically targeted the A-Tray and East Coast Crips because they controlled the drug trade in South Central, and the Mexican Mafia wanted to take that from them. It wasn't long though before the war on blacks spilled over from attacks on Crips and other gangs to attacks on civilians who just so happened to be black. In Pelican Bay State Prison in 2000, another historical incident transpired that fueled this conflict even further. Sureños ignited a massive planned attack on black inmates. This was one of the biggest, if not the biggest, racially motivated riots that was orchestrated by the Eme. And even though this particular conflict involved prison politics, it was in line with the war on the streets and the Eme's objective. In the Pacoima area, in the mid-2000s, a curfew was set by Sureño gangs on blacks out after 10 p.m. There's people who disagree with this assertion and say it's just a basis to keep the war's momentum going. But most of these claims came from several African American residents who lived in these areas themselves, or by African Americans who had witnessed some of the afflictions that had been directed at other blacks in their neighborhoods. Aside from VHG gang members that firebombed a black family's home in Hawaiian Gardens, another VHG member was also responsible for the killing of a well-known black high school football player, Mark Hammonds, as he walked down the street. In Highland Park, the Avenues gang started a long-running campaign to rid that neighborhood of blacks. The Big Hazard gang in Ramona Gardens firebombed black families that had the audacity to move into the housing project. Then there was the killing of Jamal Shaw, another famous high school football player who was gunned down and killed by 18th Street gang member Pedro Espinoza. And so it went on for some 15 years, from Riverside to San Fernando Valley, as Sureño gangs absorbed the ruthless mafia edicts, empowered by their growing demographics and the shifting balance of power on the streets. All these incidents that I've cited were some of the most egregious racially motivated acts that have taken place over the years. But the worst example yet might even be the 2006 slaying of Cheryl Green, a 14-year-old black girl from Harbor Gateway. The shooter, Jonathan Fajardo, 18, was a member of 204th Street, a Sureño gang that had by then been attacking and murdering new black residents in the neighborhood for several years. Fajardo, who was himself half black, was convicted, sentenced to death, and then in 2018, he was fatally stabbed by another inmate on San Quentin's death row. Some have said that he was killed because the age of his female victim was 14 years old. Luis Rodriguez, another Sureño death row inmate, was charged with his murder. Harbor Gateway is a tiny sliver of the strip that connects Los Angeles with the San Pedro port. It's an area that was relatively unknown before the murder. But as quiet and unknown as it was, it had a long-standing history of racial attacks on blacks by 204th Street. Within 2 weeks, a press conference attended by former FBI Director Robert Mueller, Mayor Antonio Villagrosa, Police Chief Bill Bratton, and Sheriff Lee Baca was held outside a tiny market the gang claimed as its territory, in which it prohibited blacks from visiting. Not long after that, federal racketeering indictments against Sureño street gangs began pulling hundreds of Sureño gang members off the streets and back into prison. Soon after, the war on blacks finally began to sputter to an end. By 2010, much of the classic gang violence that had plagued Southern California's working class neighborhoods was disappearing. Graffiti began to vanish, parks once again became safe for children, and while gangs still persisted, they became more focused on economic crimes like drug dealing, credit card fraud, gun running, smash and grab jewelry robberies, and pimping. Not great by any stretch of the imagination, but certainly better than the race-hate mayhem that had come before. These types of effectuations are what normally happens following a massive indictment when a gang or criminal organization loses a lot of its control. You see a huge de-escalation in activity before a change in power causes a vacuum effect. Because of the indictments, the streets are considered hot. So more often than not, gangs will temporarily resort to white-collar crimes and step away from the more serious organized crimes that got them caught up. You also see a domino effect that spills over to demographics, economical changes, changes in the housing market, and sometimes a much-needed reprieve in gang activity. Some of these changes gave many Latino neighborhoods a new lease on life. Property values began to soar, and residents could finally unlock the value in their homes that so many other Southern Californians took for granted. In Los Angeles, homicides began a multi-year decline, something that you don't see too often. Something that's never seen. However, one murder that wasn't included in this trend was the murder of Los Angeles County Sheriff's Deputy Jerry Ortiz. Again, Deputy Ortiz was shot in the head in June of 2005 while he was investigating the attempted murder of the black guy he was called out on. The law enforcement community was furious about this killing and called it a cowardly slaughter of a good stand-up cop, a newlywed and a father of 2 sons who was only doing his job to protect and serve the community he loved. No matter how the killing of this police officer was looked at, it was this single incident that prompted investigators from the LA County Sheriff's Department and the FBI to launch the nearly 4-year investigation to the gang. This massive investigation culminated into dozens of indictments and wave after wave of arrests, which was eventually dubbed Operation Knockout. The indictments detail attempted murder, kidnapping, firearms, narcotics, and other charges related to attacks by the gang, which is predominantly a Sureño gang who mainly operates in the little hamlet of Hawaiian Gardens, a city of about 15,000 that measures roughly 1 square mile. The indictments charge that the gang not only operates in the usual pattern of criminal acts that includes murder, attempted murder, assaults, and drug and weapons trafficking, but that VHG has also waged a campaign of terror specifically against African American members of the community. According to the indictment, Barrio Hawaiian Gardens, gang members take pride in their racism and often refer to the VHG gang as the hate gang. However, to be fair, this could be just an inflammatory opinion floated by the media or law enforcement to clearly draw racial overtones. Law enforcement claim that VHG gang members have expressed a desire to rid the city of Hawaiian Gardens of all African Americans and have engaged in a systematic effort or pattern to achieve that result by perpetrating crimes against African Americans. They might as well just call it genocide because that's exactly what it is. Gang experts and investigators ended up testifying at length about that subject in the 2007 trial of the killing of Deputy Ortiz, detailing the gang's long-standing hatred of African Americans. In the end, Jose Sepia Rasco was convicted of Ortiz's murder. During the sentencing, the judge noted that the 29-year-old gang member not only killed the deputy while hiding outside of the deputy's view behind a door, but that Seppi also allegedly tried to kill another man who was black just a few days earlier by shooting that individual in the back twice. Ortiz had been investigating the attempted murder when he was gunned down. The attempted murder victim was targeted by Seppi simply because of his paint job or his race after he was seen working in the yard of a Hawaiian Gardens home. According to one of the presiding judges that sentenced Seppi, Norwalk Superior Court Judge Philip Hickok, the judge claimed that Seppi also allegedly boasted prior to Ortiz's killing that he wanted to kill a cop and make a name for his gang. The murder was committed without regard in front of two extremely impressionable young girls, Hickok said, referring to the star witnesses in the killing of the deputy, two sisters, 8 and 10-year-old girls who described the shooting for the jury. The judge went on to claim that Seppi arranged to have witnesses, including the two very young girls, killed so that they would not testify, Hickok said. Seppi is awaiting execution on death row. In the indictments released against his fellow gang members, federal authorities allege a string of attacks on black residents, including a shooting into a home with 8 people inside. The document did not say if anyone was hit in the attack. In another instance, 2 gang members allegedly chased a black man, yelled a racist epithet at him, and beat him with a garden rake. That same man was later repeatedly stabbed by 2 gang members, according to the indictment, which charges them with his attempted murder. In another case, an Azusa gang member named Ralph Swifty Flores was sentenced to death for committing 4 murders. He was considered to be a gang enforcer who had a strong propensity for violence. One murder was a retaliation hit. A second murder was committed to eliminate a witness from testifying. His third murder was a torture murder because the victim refused to sign over the title of her car. And finally, his fourth murder was the killing of 16-year-old Christopher Lynch, who was killed at a party because he was African American. Yet, still another groundbreaking criminal case that was one of the first to be brought by the Department of Justice involved 4 Avenues 43 gang members. The prosecution described the defendants as being heavily influenced by the Mexican Mafia's racist anti-black gang campaign that called for the removal of all African Americans in their neighborhood. The 4 defendants, Alejandro Burr Martinez, Fernando Sneaky Cesares, Gilbert Lucky Saldana, and Porfirio Dreamer Avila, were all charged with violating federal hate crime laws and sentenced to life in federal prison. Meanwhile, during a press conference for Operation Knockout, next to a podium where law enforcement officials stood, were 2 large tables covered with dozens of firearms, ranging from small snub-nosed revolvers to automatic rifles seized during the investigation. In addition to the guns, deputies, officers, and agents seized multiple kilos of cocaine, methamphetamine, and heroin. They also found cash at one location, discovering $25,000 in other contraband. The investigation not only uncovered the gang's activities, it revealed the gang's strong ties to the Mexican Mafia and to Mexican drug cartels. Along with cooperation from some of the defendants in the case, several hours of monitored phone calls, seized ledgers, documents, and other indicia, the case came together like an intricate web. It demonstrated how street-level gang members have become more commonly involved with the Mexican Mafia and the Mexican drug cartels. It also outlined the symbiotic working relationship between these 2 organizations and how detrimental this toxic fraternity has become. Ties to Mexico were also found among some of those arrested who were living in the U.S. illegally after being deported, many of them for violent crimes including murder. According to the indictment, most of these guys that were indicted faced lengthy prison sentences in federal prison. In the feds, you do 85%. They want all their time. These specific indictments mark at least the second time in less than 2 years that federal authorities have accused Sureño gang members of attacking black residents because of their race. And in both cases, it happened in Southern California. What's interesting is seeing how the federal authorities have applied the RICO Act to the NF and how they've applied it to the Mexican Mafia. Although there's a lot of parallels and similarities between these 2 organizations, they've had to apply it a little different because of the differences in leadership structures. They've obviously used RICO laws to hit both of these organizations with blanket types of conspiracies, where they've been able to take down multiple members in sweeping indictments. But when you're dealing with known leaders, it's a lot more charge specific. I think the level of organization and the clear presence of a designated leadership has made the NF a favorite target by the feds, and this is why they're constantly getting hit. These particular indictments involving the Hawaiian Gardens gang also mark the single largest gang takedown at this time in U.S. history. Once again, history continues to repeat itself. Over these last 20 years, the feds have systematically used the RICO Act to disrupt, interfere, take down, and cripple several different criminal organizations. The NF has been decimated and ravaged by federal indictments, almost to the point of where a new wave of indictments are almost expected after so much time passes. The Aryan Brotherhood have also been hit with wave after wave, and it's inevitably had an adverse effect on its leadership as well. The Mexican Mafia haven't been exempt from the federal government's wrath either. In some instances, they've gone after the MA as an organization, and they've targeted some of its more highly influential members. In other instances, they've targeted whole street gangs that were operating under designated imeros in an attempt to wipe out entire neighborhoods. In the end, their purpose or the results seem to be the same: to displace the leaders and to continue funneling all the players straight into the federal prison system. I'm sure that these criminal organizations have learned some valuable lessons along the way, and I'm sure that they've used this knowledge to thwart some of the tactics that have been used against them. But it's also clear that the allure of money is something that continues to be a powerful force, a force that sometimes seems to prevail and win over better judgment. Meanwhile, business will continue to go on as usual. As more of the dedicated seasoned members continue to get caught up and sent to prison, a new cycle of up-and-coming youngsters are getting primed up and ready to fill these voids. With regard to some of the racial conflicts that allegedly took place in some of these Southern California neighborhoods over the years, let me make it inherently clear that the information contained in this profile are not, and were not, the basis of any of my personal opinions, observations, beliefs, or judgments. I merely did research on this indictment dubbed Operation Knockout and some of the other defining incidents that the media claimed were part of this ongoing racial conflict. I personally would like to think that as minorities, we come to realize that we not only have a lot in common, but that we're also being subjected to the same kind of afflictions based on our ethnicities as minorities, and that this stands true whether you're black, brown, yellow, red, or purple. I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. We're already working on getting another one out to you, so be looking for it to drop. As I mentioned to you guys earlier this week, COVID finally caught up with me. I've been sick, but I'm still trying to put out content like these profiles and the chapters. I should have my feet back under me by this week, so as soon as I'm able, I'll get back on the inner demons, the war stories, and the lives. Just bear with me for a few more days. We'll also try to get the raffles done by next weekend. On that note, let me close this up by extending our appreciation to all of you who have continued to support us. We're grateful for all your support, and this includes all the sentiments you guys have expressed by way of your comments. As we always say, we appreciate you, our viewers, as we realize that without you, we would cease to exist.